It is the 27th of December 2008, the day after Boxing Day. Across the United Kingdom, in every high street, every shopping precinct, every town centre from Truro to Inverness, something extraordinary is happening, and most of the people watching it do not yet fully understand what they are witnessing. The doors of Woolworths are open for business for one of the last times in history. The shelves have been stripped. The stock clearance that began weeks earlier has reduced this once magnificent British institution to something that looks more like an archaeological site than a shop. Empty gondola units, bare hooks where toys once hung, the remnants of the pick and mix counters, those great glass-sided towers of sweets that had been as much a part of the British childhood experience as school dinners and summer holidays, sit ransacked and hollow. Everything is discounted by at least 50%. Some sections are at 70% off. Management has long since lost control of the pricing logic. The point now is simply to move product, any product, at any price that will get it out the door. Shoppers file through in a peculiar emotional state. Some are genuinely there for the bargains, loading trolleys with chart CDs and Ladybird books, and clearance stationery at prices the chain should have been offering years ago. But many others, and you can see this on their faces if you look at the footage that survives from those final days, are there for reasons that have nothing to do with retail. They are there to say goodbye. They are taking photographs on early smartphones. They are pointing things out to their children. That is where the pick and mix used to be. That is where we used to buy your father's birthday cards. A generation of British people processing in real time the end of something they had assumed was permanent. 7 days later, on the 3rd of January 2009, the last Woolworths stores in the United Kingdom locked their doors for good. 807 shops, gone. 27,000 employees, made redundant, just after Christmas. In the middle of the deepest economic crisis the country had experienced since the Second World War. The collapse of Woolworths was not, as it has sometimes been characterized, a simple story of a company that failed to adapt to the internet age. It was not merely the story of a brand that fell out of fashion. It was the story of a retail institution that had survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the Blitz, the death of the British High Street as it existed in the 1950s, the arrival of the supermarket, the rise of out-of-town retail parks, and 2 decades of increasingly aggressive competition, only to be brought down in the end by a combination of catastrophic management decisions, a debt structure that gave it no room to survive any significant disruption, a banking sector that withdrew its support at the worst possible moment, and the particular misfortune of needing a strong Christmas trading period in the 1 year that the global financial system was in the process of collapsing. To understand how that happened, you need to go back almost exactly 100 years. Because the story of Woolworths in Britain begins, as so many things in British commercial history begin, not in Britain at all. Frank Winfield Woolworth was a farm boy from Jefferson County, New York, who had a single insight so simple and so radical that it built one of the greatest retail empires the world had ever seen. The insight was this: if you sold everything in your store at a fixed price of 5 cents or 10 cents, and you bought in bulk on a scale that nobody had previously attempted, and you passed every penny of those buying efficiencies on to the customer, you would not need to charm people or negotiate with them or convince them. You would simply need to open the doors. Woolworth opened his first successful 5 and dime store in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in 1879, having failed with an earlier attempt in Utica. By the turn of the century, he was operating a chain of stores across the northeastern United States. By 1909, when the first British Woolworths opened on Church Street in Liverpool. He was running one of the most profitable retail businesses in North America and was looking for somewhere new to deploy the concept. The timing was almost perfect. Edwardian Britain was experiencing its own version of the consumer revolution that had been reshaping American society for decades, a working class that was slowly, incrementally, gaining purchasing power. A culture of small specialist shops that had served the population for generations, but that carried prices and attitudes reflecting their protected market position rather than any real competitive pressure, and a population that had never experienced the particular pleasure of walking into a well-lit, well-stocked store and knowing that everything on the shelves would cost you either threepence or sixpence. That was the British version of the 5 and 10 pricing promise, and it was extraordinary to British shoppers encountering it for the first time. You did not need to ask the price of anything. You did not need to budget nervously for every item. You could simply walk in, browse at leisure, pick things up and put them down without the social obligation of purchase that governed relationships with specialist shopkeepers who knew your name and your family and your financial situation. Woolworths was not just cheap, it was democratic. It treated every customer identically regardless of their background, their social class, their accent, or the state of their Sunday clothes. The Liverpool store was followed rapidly by stores in Manchester, Preston, Bristol, and Leeds. By 1914, there were 44 British Woolworths stores. By the outbreak of the Second World War, that number had grown to 768. The British Woolworths had pulled ahead of its American parent in certain dimensions of its retail execution, developing stronger relationships with British manufacturers, building a more locally rooted product range, and establishing itself so firmly in the fabric of British town centres that it had ceased to feel like an American import and had become something entirely native. The stores were architecturally significant in ways that are easy to forget at this distance. Frank Woolworth had a taste for grandeur that ran ahead of his price points, and the buildings constructed for his chains on both sides of the Atlantic were designed to impress. High ceilings, wide aisles, the sensation of entering a proper building, not a shop, when you push through the doors. This was deliberate. Woolworth understood, with the instinct of a genuine retail genius, that people who could not afford luxury should still have access to the experience of luxury. The architecture of the stores was a form of democratic generosity. You could not afford a grand house, but you could spend Saturday morning in a grand building, and the building did not ask you to spend anything at all unless you chose to. The period between the end of the Second World War and the mid-1970s represents the true golden age of British Woolworths. Post-war Britain was in the process of rapid social and economic transformation. Rationing ended. Real wages began to rise in ways they had not done for a generation. Consumer goods that had been luxury items in the 1930s were becoming affordable to working and lower middle-class families for the first time. Television sets, portable radios, gramophone records, affordable clothing, cosmetics, children's toys that were not hand-me-downs. Woolworths was positioned to catch all of this. The chain expanded relentlessly through the 1950s and 1960s, adding stores, extending product ranges, becoming the default destination for an enormous proportion of British consumer spending that had nowhere else obvious to go. By the mid-1970s, there were approximately 1,100 Woolworths stores across the United Kingdom, and the chain occupied a position in British retail life that was genuinely without parallel. Not just commercially dominant, but culturally embedded in a way that very few businesses ever achieve. A significant part of that cultural embedding was the product of a deceptively simple retail innovation that would eventually become inseparable from the Woolworths identity in the British imagination. The pick and mix sweet counter arrived in British Woolworths in the 1950s and became, over the following 3 decades, one of the most effective pieces of retail theatre in the history of British shopping. The concept itself was not complicated. A selection of loose sweets, displayed in clear containers, priced by weight, allowing customers to select exactly what they wanted and combine different varieties according to their own tastes and budget. Children received it as an almost supernatural privilege. In a culture where sweet buying typically meant accepting a pre-packaged selection determined by someone else, the ability to construct your own precise combination, to take 3 of the white mice and 2 of the cola bottles and 6 of the foam shrimps and absolutely none of the ones you did not like, represented a form of consumer autonomy that felt, to a child, profoundly significant. But the pick and mix was not just a product. It was an experience that required time, deliberation, and engagement. It drew customers into the store and kept them there. It created an emotional connection between the brand and childhood memory that would prove to be one of the most durable assets the company possessed, long after every other aspect of its competitive advantage had been eroded or destroyed. The pick and mix meant that even people who had not bought anything else at Woolworths for years still felt a particular warmth toward the brand, because the brand existed in their memory as a formative pleasure. That emotional reservoir would buy Woolworths an enormous amount of goodwill in the decades to come. It would not ultimately buy it enough. The first serious structural challenges to the Woolworths model arrived in the 1970s and accelerated sharply through the 1980s. They came from multiple directions simultaneously, and the combined effect was to begin undermining the commercial foundations of the business in ways that management was slow to identify and slower still to address. The most immediately visible threat came from the supermarkets. Tesco, Sainsbury's, and Asda were in the process of transforming themselves from relatively modest grocery operations into something more ambitious. General merchandise retailers operating from large format stores on out-of-town sites with car parking that the high street could not provide, and operating costs that the prime location high street real estate Woolworths occupied could not match. Woolworths had always sold groceries alongside its non-food ranges. Now it was being outcompeted on grocery by operators who had built their entire model around grocery scale and whose growing non-food ranges were beginning to eat into the casual housewares and small items market that Woolworths considered its own. The second threat was more insidious and harder to address. The concept of the fixed price, everything under one roof value retailer, was being attacked from below by a new generation of specialist discounters who could undercut Woolworths on individual product categories by focusing exclusively on those categories, rather than trying to cover the entire consumer goods spectrum. Why buy your stationery at Woolworths when a dedicated stationery chain could offer more variety at lower prices? Why buy your music at Woolworths when a specialist record shop offered a deeper catalogue and staff who actually knew what they were selling? Why buy your toys at Woolworths when Toys R Us, which arrived in Britain in 1985, was offering a selection that made the Woolworths toy department look almost quaint? Each of these competitive incursions on its own would have been manageable. The combination of all of them, attacking different parts of the Woolworths product range simultaneously, created a pincer movement that the chain had no obvious strategic answer to. The business had been built on breadth. Breadth was now a vulnerability. The specialists could always go deeper than Woolworths on any given category, and depth was increasingly what customers wanted. What Woolworths needed in the 1980s was a period of calm, focused strategic thought, about what its role in British retail life would be in a world where the conditions that had created its original dominance had fundamentally changed. What it got instead was a series of ownership changes and restructuring exercises that consumed management attention and capital without resolving any of the underlying strategic questions. The American parent, by now operating as the F.W. Woolworth Company, had been finding the British business a useful but increasingly puzzling asset. The stores were profitable by most conventional measures, but the margin structure was thin and getting thinner, and the competitive pressures were clearly intensifying. In 1982, the British and Irish Woolworth stores were sold to Paternoster Stores, which was subsequently renamed Woolworths Holdings and listed on the London Stock Exchange. For the first time in its history, Woolworths UK was operating as an independent British company, no longer connected to its American original. The new public company made acquisitions designed to transform it into a broader retail group. The most significant was the purchase of B&Q, the DIY chain, and Superdrug, the health and beauty retailer. These were good businesses with strong futures. They were also businesses that had nothing particular to do with what Woolworths was or what its customers valued about it. The group was renamed Kingfisher in 1989, which was itself a revealing choice. By dropping the Woolworths name from the parent company, management was acknowledging, perhaps without fully intending to, that they regarded the original business as just one asset among several, rather than as the core identity of the enterprise. The Kingfisher era produced some genuine successes, primarily at B&Q and Superdrug, which were allowed to develop along their own strategic lines and became significant businesses in their own right. But the Woolworths brand itself received no coherent answer to the central strategic question that the changing retail landscape was posing. What are you for? The stores continued to evolve in a reactive, incremental way, adding and dropping product categories, experimenting with formats, investing modestly in store refurbishment, but never with the conviction or the capital that a genuine strategic repositioning would have required. By the late 1990s, the divergence within the Kingfisher group had become too obvious to manage comfortably. B&Q was a success story that did not need the distraction of being associated with a struggling generalist retailer. Superdrug was performing adequately, and Woolworths was a legacy business consuming management attention, consuming high street real estate costs, and generating declining returns without a clear path toward improvement. In 2001, Kingfisher demerged its UK and Irish stores as a separately listed company, Woolworths Group plc, taking it back to exactly the independent status it had held before the Kingfisher acquisition in 1982. 19 years of ownership by a larger group had produced no strategic transformation and had left the company carrying a debt structure that would prove fatal. The decade between the demerger in 2001 and the collapse in 2008 is the period that most directly explains what happened, and it is a decade that rewards close examination, because the evidence of coming failure was present and visible for most of it, even if no one with the power to act on that evidence found the will to do so. The newly independent Woolworths Group was not simply a chain of high street stores. It had acquired, as part of the demerger settlement, a number of other assets, including the Entertainment UK distribution business, which was one of the largest distributors of music, video, and games content in the country, supplying not just the Woolworths stores, but major supermarkets and other retailers. This business was genuinely valuable and genuinely profitable. It was also operating in a sector that was in the early stages of a structural transformation that would prove to be as disruptive as anything retail had experienced in the previous century. The rise of digital music and digital video was not unforeseeable in 2001. It was already underway. Napster had launched in 1999. The iPod arrived in 2001, the same year as the demerger. The direction of travel in music and video entertainment was visible to anyone who cared to look at it, and it pointed unambiguously toward a future in which the physical product categories that represented a significant portion of Woolworths' core revenue, chart CDs, chart DVDs, chart games, would either shrink dramatically or disappear entirely. The company that had the most to lose from that transition was not addressing it. Management was making operational decisions as though the entertainment market of 2001 would persist in essentially its current form for the foreseeable future. It would not persist for another decade. The high street store estate itself was becoming increasingly costly to maintain. Woolworths had approximately 800 stores at the time of the demerger, the vast majority of them on high street or town centre locations that commanded prime rents. These leases were long-term commitments. They could not easily be exited when trading conditions deteriorated. A retailer locked into 25-year leases on 800 prime high street locations has very limited operational flexibility when its sales per square foot begin to decline. The cost of that real estate is fixed regardless of how the business performs, and the Woolworths cost base, which had always been relatively high because of the physical size and prime location of its estate, was growing as a proportion of revenue as revenues themselves came under pressure. The management response to this situation was a series of strategic initiatives that, in retrospect, can be seen as sincere attempts to address real problems that were nonetheless insufficient in scope and poorly executed in practice. The most significant of these was the Big W experiment. Beginning in the early 2000s, Woolworths attempted to convert some of its larger stores into a big box, out-of-town format, branded Big W, intended to compete more directly with the large format Tesco and Asda superstores that were taking an increasing share of general merchandise spending. The concept acknowledged correctly that the traditional Woolworths high street format was under pressure and that the future of non-food retailing was moving toward larger spaces with more parking. But the execution was uncertain. The rollout was slow, and the Big W format never achieved the scale or the identity clarity needed to establish itself as a genuine competitor to the superstore operators who had been building this model for decades. By the mid-2000s, the Big W experiment had been quietly wound down without having resolved any of the underlying strategic challenges. The entertainment business continued to perform well in headline terms, while quietly becoming more fragile beneath the surface. Entertainment UK's distribution revenues were tied to physical media sales, and physical media sales, while still substantial in absolute terms, were beginning the long structural decline that would characterize the decade. The business was generating cash, but that cash was being generated in a market that was contracting, not growing. Every year, the company was slightly more exposed than the year before to a structural shift that was accelerating, not decelerating. The management of the newly independent Woolworths Group is worth examining with some care, because understanding the people who were making decisions and the pressures they were operating under gives you a more nuanced picture of how the decline unfolded than the simple narrative of incompetence allows. Gerald Corbett, who became chairman of the newly demerged company, was an experienced corporate executive who had previously been chief executive of Railtrack during the period of its own collapse and subsequent renationalization. This was, perhaps, not the most auspicious background for leading a company through a structural transformation, and the parallels between Railtrack and Woolworths, both of them organizations whose problems had deep structural roots that predated the current management, both of them subjected to financial pressures that ultimately exceeded their ability to respond, are not entirely coincidental. Margins remained thin. The debt did not reduce. Steve Johnson succeeded Bish Jones as chief executive in 2007 and inherited a situation that was already very close to the point of no return. Johnson moved quickly to attempt a refinancing of the company's debt and to stabilize the trading position. But he was working against the growing hostility of the credit markets and the deteriorating consumer environment that preceded the formal financial crisis of 2008. The decisions made during his brief tenure have been subject to debate, with some analysts arguing that a more aggressive and earlier engagement with the banking syndicate might have bought the company enough time to execute a managed asset sale before the full force of the financial crisis hit. Others argued that the underlying trading performance had deteriorated to a point where no amount of financial engineering could have produced a viable going concern. Both positions have merit. What makes the period between 2001 and 2008 genuinely troubling to examine is not the individual management decisions, which can each be evaluated on their individual merits, but the aggregate picture they produce. A business facing serious strategic challenges across multiple dimensions simultaneously, carrying a debt structure that allowed no margin for error, operating in markets that were structurally changing in ways unfavorable to its position, and being managed by a succession of executive teams that produced strategic reviews, produced PowerPoint presentations about transformation, produced corporate speak about focusing on core categories and driving efficiency. But that failed to produce the kind of fundamental rethinking of what Woolworths was for that the business actually required. The debt is worth spending some time on, because it is central to understanding why the company had no ability to survive the shock when it arrived. The Woolworths Group entered the new century carrying approximately £385 million in debt. This was not an unusual level of corporate debt in absolute terms for a business of Woolworths' size, but it was debt being serviced by a business whose cash generation was increasingly unreliable, and whose assets primarily store leases and inventory rather than owned property or patents or other forms of durable value, were declining in quality. The interest payments on that debt consumed a meaningful portion of the operating cash flow that the business generated, leaving relatively little available for the kind of capital investment in store improvement, systems upgrade, and strategic transformation that would have been required to mount a genuine competitive response to the challenges the company faced. The banks who held the debt were watching the company's performance with growing unease through the middle years of the decade. Credit facilities were being maintained, but the appetite for increasing exposure to the business was limited. Any serious program of investment in transformation would have required either additional borrowing, which the banks were increasingly reluctant to provide on terms the company could service, or a major equity raise, which would have significantly diluted existing shareholders at a time when the share price was already reflecting the market's concerns about the business's trajectory. The company was, in the language of corporate finance, trapped, not yet in immediate crisis, but without the financial flexibility to invest its way out of the competitive position it had allowed itself to fall into. Every year of operational decline made the trap slightly tighter. The year 2007 was the last year in which Woolworths might have been able to execute any kind of managed transition or sale to a buyer who could have provided the capital and strategic coherence the business needed. The company was still trading. The stores were still generating footfall. The brand still carried enormous emotional resonance with the British public. A well-capitalized buyer with a clear vision of what Woolworths could become might have been able to use those assets as the foundation for a genuine transformation. No such buyer emerged. The conversations that took place about possible strategic combinations or acquisitions during 2007 did not produce a transaction. The management continued to manage. The banks continued to review their exposure. And then, in September 2008, the financial world changed in ways that made every question about Woolworth's long-term strategic position suddenly irrelevant, because the company was now fighting for its survival in the present. The collapse of Lehman Brothers on the 15th of September 2008 triggered a global financial crisis of a scale and severity that had not been seen since 1929. Within days, credit markets that had been functioning normally were frozen. Banks that had been lending freely to corporate borrowers were reviewing every credit line with extreme caution. The appetite for risk in the financial system evaporated almost overnight, and the companies most exposed to that withdrawal of appetite were precisely the ones that had been relying on continued access to credit to service existing obligations and maintain ongoing operations. Woolworths was one of those companies. Its credit facilities with its banking syndicate were due for renewal or renegotiation, and they came up for review at exactly the moment the banking sector was in the grip of the most severe crisis of confidence in living memory. The banks looked at Woolworths, looked at what the global financial crisis was doing to consumer confidence and retail spending, looked at the company's debt load and its declining cash generation, and made the decision that has defined how the story is remembered. They withdrew the credit facility. The specific sequence of events in the autumn of 2008 is more complex than this summary suggests, involving multiple rounds of negotiation, competing valuations of the business, attempts to find alternative financing, and genuine uncertainty on all sides about whether a workable outcome was possible. But the essential dynamic was clear. Woolworths needed access to credit to fund its working capital requirements through the crucial Christmas trading period. The banks were not willing to provide that credit on terms the company could accept, and without that credit, the business could not survive. The specific sequence of events in the autumn of 2008 is more complex than this summary suggests, involving multiple rounds of negotiation, competing valuations of the business, attempts to find alternative financing, and genuine uncertainty on all sides about whether a workable outcome was possible. But the essential dynamic was clear. Woolworths needed access to credit to fund its working capital requirements through the crucial Christmas trading period. The banks were not willing to provide that credit on terms the company could accept, and without that credit, the business could not survive. The banking syndicate involved in the Woolworths credit facility included some of the institutions that were themselves in the most difficulty during the autumn of 2008. ICICI Bank, which held a portion of the Woolworths debt, was itself facing significant liquidity pressures during this period. The willingness of any lender to increase or even maintain exposure to a troubled retailer in the middle of a banking system crisis was essentially zero, regardless of whatever the underlying business merits of a continued lending relationship might have been in different conditions. The credit markets were not making nuanced judgments about individual company prospects during this period. They were retreating from risk comprehensively, and Woolworths was a risk. There were discussions during October and November 2008 about possible rescue scenarios that have been reported in varying degrees of detail since the collapse. A private equity buyer was reportedly approached. The possibility of a partial sale of the store estate to reduce the debt load was discussed. The option of a company voluntary arrangement, which would have allowed the business to negotiate reduced lease obligations with its landlords and potentially create a more sustainable cost structure, was examined. None of these options was realized in time. The CVA option in particular required the cooperation of landlords who were themselves concerned about the implications of a major tenant default and who were not in a position to offer concessions quickly enough to make a difference to the administration timeline. The appointment of administrators was announced on the 26th of November 2008. Deloitte were engaged as administrators. The formal announcement confirmed what many retail industry observers had been anticipating for several weeks. Woolworths was in administration. The question was no longer whether the business could be saved as a going concern, but whether a buyer could be found who would take on all or part of the estate, and on what timeline. The Deloitte administrators faced a situation that was, in some respects, technically straightforward, and in others, genuinely difficult. The straightforward part was the mandate: realize the maximum value from the available assets and distribute those proceeds according to the established legal priority of creditors. The difficult part was executing that mandate against a backdrop of 807 trading stores, a Christmas trading calendar already underway, 27,000 employees whose pay remained the administrator's legal responsibility for as long as the store stayed open, and a public profile that attracted far more scrutiny than most corporate insolvencies generate. The decision to continue trading through Christmas, rather than closing the stores immediately, was made on the basis that the Christmas period represented the best opportunity to realize maximum value from the remaining stock. The stores were full of seasonal inventory. Closing them in late November would have meant selling that stock at deeper discounts through liquidators than could be achieved by selling it directly to the public through the stores. The commercial logic was sound. The human experience of working in and shopping in a chain that everyone knew was dying was more complicated. The Deloitte team ran a parallel process, attempting to sell the business or significant parts as a going concern, because a going concern sale would have produced better returns for creditors than a pure liquidation. This generated considerable public interest and a number of expressions of interest, most of which did not survive close examination. The lease obligations alone, 800 long leases on prime high street locations with years remaining, represented a liability most potential buyers were unwilling to absorb. In the conditions of late 2008, the only element sold as something resembling a going concern was Entertainment UK, the distribution business, acquired by Bertram Group in December 2008. Meaningful, but not a rescue of the retail operation itself. The answer to that question arrived slowly and painfully over the following weeks, during what should have been the most important trading period in the Woolworths calendar. Christmas was coming. The shops were still open. The administrators were running a fire sale, not a structured business, and the distinction was apparent to anyone who visited a Woolworths store in those final weeks. Stock clearance dominated everything. Pricing logic had been suspended in favor of simply realizing whatever cash could be realized from the remaining inventory. The Christmas decorations went up in the stores as they always had, because the lease obligations required the stores to remain trading, and because the seasonal stock needed to be sold. But there was a surreal quality to the Christmas displays in a building that everyone in it knew was in the process of dying. The attempts to find a buyer for the business as a going concern were energetic and ultimately unsuccessful. Several parties expressed interest in parts of the estate. The pick and mix concept attracted interest from confectionery businesses who understood the brand value of the format. The entertainment business attracted interest from potential acquirers who saw value in the distribution relationships. The store estate attracted expressions of interest from several retailers looking for prime high street locations they could refit and rebrand. The stock that remained was cleared at heavily discounted prices. And then, on the 3rd of January 2009, the last stores closed. It is worth pausing here on the human dimension of what happened, because the corporate narrative of debt and strategic failure and banking decisions can obscure the fact that this was not an abstract financial event. It was something that happened to approximately 27,000 people, the majority of them part-time and lower-wage workers. And it happened to them in the period immediately after Christmas, at the worst possible time in the economic cycle for finding alternative employment, in the middle of a recession that would produce the highest unemployment figures the United Kingdom had seen for a generation. Many of those workers had been with the company for years or decades. Woolworths had been, in many British communities, a significant employer of people who were not highly educated, not professionally credentialed, not easily mobile between employers and industries. The checkout operators and stockroom staff and department supervisors who had built their working lives around their Woolworths store were not, in most cases, well positioned to find equivalent employment quickly. The redundancy payments that Woolworths workers received through the administration process were, in many cases, significantly less than they would have received in a conventional redundancy. Because the administration process treats employee claims as unsecured creditors, ranking behind the secured lending of the banks and the fees of the administrators. There were cases of workers who had been employed by Woolworths for 20 years or more, receiving redundancy payments of a few £100s. There were cases of workers who had been promised Christmas bonuses that were voided by the administration process. There were workers who had continued working through the administration period on the understanding that their wages were protected, only to find that protections they had believed were in place were less complete than they had understood. The generosity that the store had shown its customers in its better years was not available to be extended to its workforce in its final ones. The liquidation of the physical estate produced some remarkable scenes. When the Woolworths pick and mix equipment was auctioned off, it attracted bidders from across Britain and beyond, people who wanted to own a piece of something that had been part of their childhood. The chrome and glass containers that had held the foam shrimps, and the cola bottles, and the chocolate mice sold at prices that surprised even the auctioneers. The Woolworths signage, the distinctive red lettering on white that had hung above British high streets for 100 years, attracted bidders who wanted it as a form of cultural relic. The brand had emotional value that the business had somehow failed to convert into sustainable commercial value, and that emotional value was now being realized in the saddest possible way. The Woolworths website, which had been trading as an online retailer with some success in the years before the collapse, continued to operate under new ownership following the administration. ShopDirect, which had acquired the brand name, used woolworths.co.uk as part of a broader online retail operation. This felt, to many observers, like a particularly strange form of haunting. The name was still there. The URL was still there. But the thing the name represented, the physical stores, the pick and mix, the Saturday morning experience, the sense of a shop that had been part of the furniture of British life, was gone. The 807 stores that had traded under the Woolworths name did not remain empty for long. High street locations of that quality and scale in British town centres were in demand from a range of operators. The largest single occupier of former Woolworths sites was Poundland, the fixed-price discount retailer which took on dozens of former stores across the country. There was an irony here that was not lost on retail historians. Poundland had been founded in 1990 on a concept that bore some resemblance to the original Woolworths proposition, the democratizing power of fixed-price, accessible retail, and had built a successful business by occupying exactly the market position that Woolworths had once occupied and then abandoned in favor of a more complicated and ultimately unsuccessful attempt at general merchandise retailing. The successors who moved into Woolworths stores were, in a sense, doing what Woolworths itself should have been doing. Other former Woolworths sites were taken by Iceland, the frozen food retailer, which saw an opportunity in the post-crisis retail environment to expand its presence in town centres, whose primary traffic generators had been weakened by the financial crisis. Wilko, formerly Wilkinson's, another general merchandise retailer with a clear value proposition and a more disciplined approach to product range and cost management than Woolworths had managed in its final decade, also took on a significant number of former sites. In this respect, the collapse of Woolworths can be seen as having, paradoxically, accelerated the growth of some of its more capable successors. The question of why Woolworths actually failed has been debated by retail analysts, business historians, and former employees ever since the last stores closed, and it is a question that resists simple answers. The temptation is to reach for a single explanation, to say it was the internet, or it was the supermarkets, or it was bad management, or it was the banking crisis, and to treat the collapse as the inevitable consequence of that single factor. The reality is more complicated and more instructive. The internet and the structural shift away from physical entertainment media was certainly a major factor. Entertainment UK, the distribution business, was operating in a dying market and did not have the strategic agility to transform itself quickly enough. The Woolworths store's heavy reliance on chart music, chart DVDs, and chart games as footfall drivers made them acutely vulnerable to the shift in how people consumed entertainment. These were not marginal categories for the business. They were central to the commercial proposition, and when they began to erode, there was no ready replacement for the footfall and the margin they had been providing. The supermarkets were certainly a factor. Tesco and Asda and Morrisons had been steadily expanding their non-food ranges throughout the 1990s and 2000s, and by the time of Woolworths' collapse, they were offering reasonably competitive versions of almost every category that Woolworths traded in, on more accessible sites with better parking, with the additional convenience of being able to do your grocery shopping at the same time. The supermarkets had effectively colonized the general merchandise space that Woolworths had once owned, and they had done it by competing on convenience and price scale that Woolworths' cost structure could not match. Management failure was also undeniably a factor. The strategic incoherence of the Woolworths business in its final 2 decades. The inability to articulate a clear positioning that distinguished the brand from its competitors and gave customers a compelling reason to choose Woolworths over the alternatives that were steadily multiplying around it reflects poorly on successive management teams. The Big W experiment, the various initiatives around loyalty cards and own brand development and store refurbishment, represented genuine attempts to address real problems, but were collectively insufficient in ambition and inconsistent in execution. A business that had been repositioned with the clarity and the conviction that the situation demanded might have survived in a different form. But the factor that made failure inevitable rather than merely possible was the debt structure. A business with a manageable debt load in the same trading environment, with the same competitive pressures, would have had options that Woolworths did not have. It could have invested in transformation. It could have closed underperforming stores without triggering a crisis in its working capital. It could have survived a bad Christmas and continued trading into a recovery. The debt removed all of those options, and meant that when the banking crisis arrived and the credit facility was withdrawn, there was no path forward that did not involve administration. The banking crisis of 2008 was the immediate cause of death. The debt was the structural cause. The strategic failure was the underlying cause. And if you want to find the deepest cause of all, the one that made everything else more difficult to address, you have to look at the period of the Kingfisher ownership in the 1980s and 1990s, when the company had the time and the resources to invest in a genuine strategic transformation and instead made acquisitions that enriched the group as a whole, without addressing the fundamental question of what Woolworths was for in a changed retail landscape. History does not offer clean moral lessons, but it does sometimes offer clean cautionary ones. The story of Woolworths UK is a cautionary tale about the danger of allowing a business that is culturally beloved but strategically adrift to drift for too long without addressing the strategic questions that cultural affection allows management to avoid. The goodwill that British consumers felt toward Woolworths was real, the affection for the pick and mix, the affection for the store that had been part of their childhood and their parents' childhood, the affection for the idea of a shop where everyone was welcome and everything was affordable. That affection was genuine and deep, and it bought the company time that a less loved brand would not have had. But affection is not a business model. Nostalgia does not pay the interest on a £385 million debt facility. The goodwill that Woolworths had accumulated over a century of trading in British high streets could not be converted into the cash flows required to service the obligations the business had accumulated or to fund the transformation the business needed. 15 years after the last Woolworths store closed its doors, the affection has not diminished. There are Facebook groups with hundreds of thousands of members dedicated to memories of Woolworths. There are petitions, some serious, most not, calling for the brand to be revived as a physical retail presence. The annual anniversaries of the closure are marked by news articles and social media discussion that generate engagement levels far higher than stories about retailers that are currently trading and currently employing people. Every Christmas, without fail, some combination of journalists and social media users revisits the story and finds a fresh audience for it, people who were children in 2008 encountering the details for the first time and experiencing an unexpected grief for something they barely consciously remembered having lost. The emotional response to the end of Woolworths has proved more durable than anyone who was not paying close attention to what the brand meant to people would have predicted. In surveys of British consumer sentiment conducted in the decade following the closure, Woolworths consistently appeared as one of the brands most missed by the public, outperforming many businesses that were significantly larger in their scale and more important to the broader economy at the time of their collapse. The gap between commercial significance and emotional significance, rarely clearer than in the case of Woolworths, tells you something important about what certain brands actually are and what actually gives them value. Part of that response reflects something specific about Woolworths, and part of it reflects something more general about the British High Street and what has happened to it since 2008. The closure of Woolworths was not an isolated event. It was a significant early data point in a broader pattern of high street attrition that has continued and accelerated over the subsequent decade and a half. Blockbuster, HMV, Jessop's, Comet, BHS, Mothercare, Debenhams, Arcadia. The list of British retail brands that have either disappeared or been dramatically reduced since 2008 is long and continues to grow. Each closure has added to a cumulative sense of loss that goes beyond any individual brand. Woolworths was the first major casualty of that period, and in some ways the most symbolically weighted one. because Woolworths had been there for so long and had meant so much to so many people. It was the retail equivalent of losing a local landmark that has been part of the landscape for as long as anyone can remember. You know, abstractly, that nothing lasts forever, but when the thing that seemed permanent actually disappears, the shock is disproportionate to any rational assessment of its commercial importance. The pick and mix has had several subsequent lives in British retail, which is perhaps the most eloquent demonstration of the brand's enduring power. Multiple operators have attempted to revive the concept in various forms, at cinema chains, at shopping centre pop-ups, at festivals and fairs and seasonal markets. None has replicated the original with complete success, because the pick and mix was not really about the sweet. It was about the specific context of the Woolworths store, the specific memory of standing with your parents or your grandparents beside the counter and being given permission to choose your own combination, the specific sensory experience of the store environment in which it was embedded. The concept without the context is just loose sweets sold by weight, which you can find in 100 places. The thing that made it special is irretrievable. The workers who lost their jobs in January 2009 have, in the main, moved on to other employment and other lives. Some of the longest-serving employees who were most publicly vocal about their situation in the immediate aftermath of the closure have spoken in subsequent years about the difficulty of the transition, the sense of displacement, the particular cruelty of the timing just after Christmas, but also about the eventual rebuilding of working lives in other sectors and other organizations. The human cost was real and was borne disproportionately by people who had the fewest resources to absorb it. But people are resilient, and the story did not end with the last store closing. The brand itself, having been used by Shop Direct for the better part of a decade as an online retail operation, was eventually retired from that use as well. The woolworths.co.uk domain still exists in various forms depending on when you look for it, but the active, seriously resourced online retail operation that Shop Direct had been operating under the brand quietly wound down. The name that Frank Woolworth had first put above a store in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in 1879, and that had been above the door of a Liverpool shop in 1909, and that had been a fixture of British high streets for a century, eventually faded even from the digital environment where it had briefly found a second life. What remains is memory. Photographs taken by shoppers in those final weeks of December 2008 who understood, in a way that the company's management perhaps never fully had, that they were witnessing the end of something irreplaceable. Recordings of people queuing at the liquidation counters, taking one last bag of pick and mix from a counter that was already three-quarters empty. Recollections published in local newspapers and online forums by former employees describing their last shift, the strange mixture of sadness and dark humor with which retail workers tend to navigate exactly these kinds of endings, and the buildings. Scattered across the British urban landscape, there are dozens of buildings that still bear the unmistakable imprint of having once been Woolworths. The architectural gestures that the original store designs made toward grandeur, the height of the ceilings, the proportions of the shop fronts, the scale of the spaces that were designed to make ordinary people feel that they were somewhere worthy of their time and their attention, survive in buildings that are now Poundlands and Primark and Wilko's and Iceland stores and, in some cases, are empty and awaiting redevelopment. Those buildings are, in their own way, a form of monument, not to the management failures and the debt structures and the strategic drift that ended the company, but to the original idea that Frank Woolworth brought from upstate New York to a Liverpool high street in 1909, The idea that you could build a great business by treating every customer with equal dignity regardless of their means, by offering them quality and variety and the pleasure of browsing without obligation, by making the act of shopping in your stores feel like something worth the journey. That idea was sound. It had sustained one of the most successful retail operations in British history for the better part of a century. It was not the idea that failed. What failed was the ability of successive generations of management and the financial structures they inherited and added to find a way of carrying that idea forward into a retail environment that had changed beyond recognition from the one in which it had originally thrived. The Christmas that killed Woolworths was not really about Christmas at all. It was the moment when everything that had been going wrong for a very long time finally converged in a way that left no room for delay, no room for another review, no room for another strategy document, no room for another year of managing decline in the hope that something would change. The credit markets froze. The banks made their decision. And in the end, it came down to a banking decision made in the autumn of 2008 that the company had no financial cushion to absorb and no alternative financing to replace. Britain's favourite shop, gone before the decorations came down.